far less amusing. This one, dear colleagues, I'd like to thank the Scientific Commission that has asked me to address with you a very simple question. Is there a role left for high-frequency oscillation in the current context of ARDS, notably in recent developments such that at the end of the day, the technique at the time of the Berlin definition, this technique was still in yellow, and we thought revert to patients that had the severe forms of ARDS as defined by Berlin. If we stick to Claude results, I believe we have a reason to do that. We can today state that patients who have less than 150 ratio of PO over F, we must offer them a long proning session and possibly even a second if they don't have the contrary indications such that number of patients were not included. So what is the role of HFO? Well, obviously it's becoming increasingly slimmer, and aside for a randomized trial where the most severe patients where nothing is working, well, there aren't that many, but there are nevertheless a few patients for whom, in spite of everything, in spite of proning, we have a few, in spite of hypercapnic permissive attempts and reduction in tidal volume. There's hypercapnia that is linked to major respiratory acidosis. In these patients for a very long time, we can basically the same people, I would say, who were thinking about the physiology behind the physiology of the prone position, thinking that there's possibly a rationale for using a ventilation technique based on very high frequencies, very high frequency of a tidal volume that's lower than the space, a recruitment technique that is based on the use of permanent distension pressure to keep the lung open over. It's fully recruited, and it ends up by there's a de-recruitment point at the maximum curve portion on the expiratory curve of the volume pressure curve. So the assumption on high-frequency oscillation on ventilation, because overall there's kind of a happy mix of all these techniques, even if they're fairly different, by using a permanent distension pressure that's sufficient to open the lung and avoid it closing, and using tidal volumes that will be lower than the spacing at a high frequency, and thereby by changing the mechanism that governs the gas interaction without looking purely at convection, we can ventilate these patients by ensuring their oxygenation, CO2 in adults between 3 and 7 hertz rather than 3 and 15 hertz. This has been used by pediatricians for a very long time. A lot of experimental papers, I'll spare you the literature, not very good experimental models of ARDS for surfactants where everything seems to work. But we need to bear that in mind, because there's maybe something to be saved for clinical practice on these modules. It improves recruitments, reduces villi. Well, on these models, everything works. We won't discuss them. Some papers show a more homogeneous distribution of ventilation. Let me just flag this one, not as old as the others. When we look at how a volume of 80 milliliters in HFO versus conventional mechanical ventilation, it's more homogeneous, but in a model that's fairly easy to open. It's not a pneumonia model. Up until last year, very few randomized studies. I kept the new ones for the end. There was this US piece of work by Stephen Durdak, where they randomized patients, 75 patients in each group, treated mechanical ventilation with a volume that wasn't strictly kosher, 6 and 10 milliliters per kilo, not strictly ideal, and improved survival rate in this at 90 days. Side effects pretty much similar in both groups. So conclusion of this paper didn't look at severe ARDS, not that it failed conventional ventilation, doesn't seem to kill patients who are not very severe. Once again, we can't draw very much from that. 6 to 10 milliliters kilos, 10 mLs, far more mortality than 6, and the mortality of the control groups overstated. That's why we stopped this study, which was the response to the US study after very few patients, because we knew full well that we wouldn't publish this much beyond critical care. So what else do we have? What else? A lot of clinical cases, a lot of patient series that have been treated, and the people looking at evidence-based medicine, doing meta-analyses, looked at the efficacy of HFO. To be quite honest, there's not much very common in these studies. And when we look at these studies, we have the impression that in terms of mortality on this meta-analysis, it would tend to reduce mortality. I mean, once again, I hate meta-analyses, and this one here, I mean, these studies have absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with one another. When we look on physiological parameters, does it work in terms of oxygenation, CO2? I mean, does it work? We have a sense that when it's used in patients that have failed in conventional ventilation, a number of patients where we will be able to improve the PO/F ratio over the first 48, 72 hours, number of patients where the P/F will improve, but they're only physiological metrics. On this meta-analysis, once again, looking at the impact of barotrauma, and in this meta-analysis, not more barotrauma in HFO than in conventional mechanical ventilation. And if there's a signal in one direction, it was that in favor of protection. But it was high-frequency oscillation done wisely. It was HFO with a frequency of around 5-6 hertz and with a permanent distended pressure 5-6 centimeters above the mean pressure obtained, the last mean pressure obtained, conventional mechanical ventilation when these patients were deteriorating in conventional mechanical ventilation. And you'll see in a moment that it's not at all what was used in the Canadian trial. And it may well explain to us one thing, which is it didn't seem to kill the patients. The Canadian trial is a different ball game. We're coming to it. So these are the two trials presented and published last year, give or take around the same time. The hot topics of ACCM this time last year, the Oscillate from our Toronto friends, and the Duncan Young Oscar, the UK, both in the same issue of the New England, which rather did sound the knell for this and brought down the stock of sensormetics. No conflict of interest. Never received a penny from sensormedics. Okay, the OSCE, 548 randomized patients, randomized conventional mechanical ventilation, 6 millimeters per kilo, FiO2, PEP algorithm, fairly straightforward Canadian style. And on the other hand, on the other side, in the left-hand corner, something that's always ready to wear. There's an algorithm for patients who are randomized to be ventilized with the mean pressure after 3 recruitment maneuvers, starting at 30, and that will change on the basis of this algorithm. Let me flag that 30 is between 0.4, 0.6 of FiO2. And if you need more than 0.6 FiO2, which is all the patients that we put in HFO in our center, well, we're never below 30 a protocol. We're going to be at 32, 34, 34, 36, 38. And here I can tell you, it does not work. At 36 or 38 mean pressure, I see Antoine, who's excited. He said, okay, I'm going to play around with the echocardiogram. Shows that it leads to catastrophes, this thing does. If you start from the principle that everything's recruitable, I would say that whatever the technique, and if you build your algorithm where, once again, we're talking ready to wear, not bespoke, with a strategy designed to up the pressure when the patients are highly hypoxemic, there happens what is bound to happen. I won't detail the protocol. Conventional mechanical ventilation was done rather well. The targets in terms of oxygenation, PCO2, well, the real problem is, one, the mean pressure, and two, everything that went with it, the hemodynamic management and sedation management. The study was discontinued before the end because you realize that mortality is higher than in the HFO group than in the control ventilation group. There are explanations, there are several, so people point to the fact that these patients are more sedated with systematic neuromuscular blockade. We're looking at propofol, ventanine, everything was higher. The only thing that was lower was the blood pressure, the arterial pressure. And so these patients receive far more drugs, vasoactive, than the others. And it's not a miracle. If we try and use this protocol at Cochin as well as Toronto, it won't work and we'll kill patients because we'll kill them from circulatory disorders, and we won't see the results that we observe in terms of PCO2. You won't see them because they're not circulating for interaction. There needs to be some flow, and the right ventricle must work some. Then there's the other paper, which is the UK, Duncan Young. We're looking here at patients, a bit like the first. These are patients P to F ratio below 200 with a PEP above or equal to 5. These patients, there's a high number who don't really keep us awake. A PEP at 8 and 190 PF ratio. I'm not sure that that is the definition of a severe ARDS as Claude or Alain defines them, and I'm convinced that it's not those patients who benefit from these exception techniques. So here again, there are algorithms, but you can craft a simple algorithm, a complicated algorithm. The problem is that it remains an algorithm at the end of the day. The problem with these patients with severe with lung infection, with images predominant on one side, don't necessarily surfactant depreciation, very diffused. Problem with those images that if you don't have a very detailed analysis of the physiology of the thing, it's likely to be complicated, and that's what's happened here. It's the same when we look at the PF ratio. We see that overall these are patients who initially are not very severe, 190, 200 PF ratio. The other thing is that in the weaning for HFO had to go to 24 centimeters of water, permanent distension for weaning. We have shifted them back to conventional mechanical ventilation, say remain ventilated HFO for a long time in the protocol. And it wasn't the same machine. With this machine here in this protocol, it doesn't kill the patient, and at least there was no difference. The study went through completion. What they show is that the target populations are plainly not the right ones, that the protocols tested, the Canadian protocol does not work, even dangerous. Fully agree with that statement. Physiology matters, and it matters in the most severe patients at the patient bedside. When we do cardiorespiratory physiology, we see that not all patients react the same way, and that to adapt the settings in light of what the patient does and not the algorithm counts, and also the limits of what can be done with these mega clinical trials where we want to enter thousands of patients to show 5% reduction in mortality. When we craft the trial, we target the and the physiology, we can get there with less. So Oscillate and Oscar, not the population. In Berlin, we thought that we needed to look at these additional adjuvant techniques. I don't think it's those patients that benefit. What didn't work, clearly, in the Canadian trial, a priority clearly given to upping the pressure levels, questionable management of hemodynamics and cardiovascular physiology, and that explains the results, negative results of this trial. Of course, there are always patients who respond, always patients who don't respond. 190 patients in Canada treated with HFO. In HFO, you need to 6 to 8 hours before you start to see results. Half the patients, it doesn't work in terms of the P over F ratio, but there's no technique. There are only responders. When we look at the experience of people do a bit more physiology, and notably the UK Richard Beer group, looking at the factors to predict an improvement, well, in fact, we find things that we found here. The oxygenation index after a few. I'll show you this one just to demonstrate that patients that benefit are fewer, even if when we broaden the criteria, not just patients, not in terms of gas exchange, but can no longer be protectively ventilated, the number of indications shrinked. 121 medical resuscitation, lung injuries, immunodepressed. With a protocol, we do physiology. The P to F ratio rises, PCO2 declines. Hemodynamically, it's not a catastrophe. We fill them beforehand, we fill them, and we fill them after, as was the case for conventional and for catecholamines. Patients where we do solve the problem of respiratory oscillosis, and these are patients that are treated rescue, 50% survival. It's not miraculous, but once again, it's not a randomized trial. It's physiology at the bedside. In that patient, it may well work. The factors that worked in terms of prediction: PCO2 above 55H6, oxygenation index 21%, 72. When we take them and we bring them to the scanner, we realize that there are patients in whom it doesn't work. When you perform scans at the end of inspiration, expiration in these patients, the potential recruitment is far higher in diffuse than in severe ARDS. The non-aerated volume here, the increase in the aerated volume greater in the diffuse, in the lobar and over-distended and the lobar patients. By better selecting our patients, we can maybe use this technique from time to time. Really, what do we do differently? Patient selection, we adjust the settings, patient physiology, and what we're seeing in terms of hemodynamics and in echocardiography. We don't systematically use the muscle blockades. The management of secretion is not trivial. 48 hours, if not a fibroscopy of the bronchial lavage, you'll have some worries. This comes with a learning curve, and that learning curve cannot be obtained if you don't have enough patients in the year. In other words, my conclusion is that high-frequency oscillation in very severe patients, I don't think it's dangerous. Don't believe it's dangerous, and it works in a considerable number of patients when it's done like a recruitment technique by adjusting to the physiology of patients. We need to do this acutely, not after 3 weeks. It needs to be done at the beginning, watching the hemodynamics, and HFO as ECMO only reserved to centers that see many ARDS cases. And I'll leave you with a take-home message for the most severe patients. It's better to have ready-to-wear bespoke solutions. Otherwise, we're wide of the mark.